Journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed by a powerful car bomb minutes after leaving her home on the 16th of October 2017. Almost 9 years later, the man accused of masterminding her murder is on trial. Caruana Galizia, Malta's most prominent journalist, shot to fame with her reporting on the Panama Papers. The bomb was planted beneath the driver's seat. An eyewitness told jurors she was still conscious and screaming behind the wheel seconds before the explosion. The 3 men who carried out the hit and 2 more who supplied the bomb have already been convicted. Now, the man accused of ordering and financing the murder is in the dock. Yorgen Fenech headed one of Malta's largest dynastic business empires, with deep political ties. He had not been a major focus of Caruana Galizia's reporting before her death, but she had exposed a mysterious offshore company called 17 Black that was closing in on alleged corruption linked to a major gas power plant deal. Fenech was the key commercial interface on this and other major ventures with the government. And it was later revealed that 17 Black was central to a corruption scandal that later saw him face separate corruption charges, along with the former Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Keith Cambry, and former Energy Minister Conrad Mizzi. Both deny involvement in the corruption case. The lead murder investigation has testified in the trial that the evidence points to Fenech being the sole mastermind. The defense, however, is trying to redirect attention towards 2 suspects, Keith Cambry and the former Economy Minister Chris Cardona. 2 of the convicted hitmen also implicated both politicians in a fiery hearing, although their evidence is being strongly challenged. Both Keith Cambry and Chris Cardona deny the claims. But beyond the courtroom drama, the proceedings are extraordinary. Global Initiative research shows that in assassinations of this nature, the masterminds almost never face justice. That is what makes this trial consequential. It tests whether powerful people accused of murdering those who stand in their way can be held accountable. I'm Mark Micallef. I lead the North Africa and Sahel Observatory for the Global Initiative, but I also happen to be a former news editor at the Times of Malta, the leading circulation newspaper on the island, and have known Daphne personally, as did anyone who worked in the business, and followed closely and painfully the events after her death. So Daphne was a very controversial figure. To a very large extent, that's irrelevant at this point, but it is relevant particularly for an outside observer looking inside, because it helps understand the dynamics that have also led to and impeded and undermined the road to justice. And by that I mean Daphne was a very polarized and divisive journalist who broke a number of very, very important stories, particularly in the latter part of her career before her death. But her blog also contained a number of informally written, salacious tidbits about some politicians and their families, for instance. And this in a very, very divided, politically divided country, sort of framed her, particularly among the Labour Party, which was her primary target, and their supporters, as a political target in their own right. And so we had the horrible situation of some people celebrating her death after it was announced, in spite of it being a clearly horrific murder that shocked the vast majority of the population and the international community. Basically, what we know from the part concerning the hitmen and the people who supplied the bomb, who've all been convicted, she was essentially spied upon for a significant period of time, and then eventually a decision was made to kill her using a car bomb. A bomb was placed underneath her car. It's important to note that her assassination followed a number of hits that had been taken out on several different individuals in the preceding years. All of those individuals were somehow connected to the underworld. So Daphne's assassination totally stood apart from all of those, but the mechanics and even the people involved in the eventual assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, at least in part, were involved in some of those hits. The trial now is about the mastermind. So we're at the next level, and the person in the dock, Yorgen Fenech, is the scion of one of Malta's largest business conglomerates, if not the largest, the Thomas Group. He was in an extraordinary position of power, and up to the point where his name was mentioned in the investigation, was a person who was known to be very close to the Labour Party, but a person, in generally speaking, in good standing, a very powerful businessman. So he's essentially accused of having commissioned the murder and paid for it. In the trial, we heard evidence, again, this was not a new fact per se, in which the contract itself was said to be worth 150,000 euros. And the speculation vis-a-vis the motive, which hasn't never really been clarified per se, other than an assumption that she was being killed due to something that was being published. And in the trial itself, we've also heard evidence of Fenech allegedly wanting to have her killed because of something she was going to publish. Fenech's link to the previous Labour administration, I think the most high-profile connection concerns his involvement in a consortium that bid for the ElectroGas power plant. That was the signature promise made by the Labour Party before its re-election, before it coming into power in 2013. He was also later found to be the ultimate beneficiary owner of an offshore company based in Dubai called 17 Black. Daphne had reported on 17 Black, but had not yet linked 17 Black to Yorgen Fenech. But she had, on one hand, started flagging 17 Black as something of concern, and on the other hand, really closing in on alleged corruption concerning the ElectroGas power plant. These two things later came together, and Fenech, the former chief of staff, Keith Cambry, and the former energy minister now face separate corruption charges, along with a string of other individuals that see 17 Black as a sort of central clearinghouse for alleged payments that were made in connection with the ElectroGas power plant deal. During the first days, actually, of the trial, we heard the lead investigator, Keith Arnaud, who's now Assistant Police Commissioner, really presenting the evidence as having locked in on Yorgen Fenech as being the sole mastermind in this case. The defense has been essentially trying to deviate attention to other potential suspects, and in particular, the former chief of staff mentioned earlier in the corruption allegations, as well as the former economy minister, Chris Cardona. Both Keith Cambry and Chris Cardona deny the claims. From a Maltese perspective, it's extraordinary because Malta doesn't have a very good track record when it comes to closing particularly high-profile assassinations such as these. There's a string of other such cases that were never resolved. In some cases, not even at the level of who carried out the hit. But even if we take a broader look, the Global Initiative has carried out substantial research on a number of assassinations globally. Assassination has always been a very significant part of what we do as an organization, always recognizing the crippling effect that assassinations of this kind have in the fight against organized crime. And what we find is that in assassinations of this nature, it is always a very, very tiny minority of cases in which the masterminds get identified, let alone get to face justice. So it's extraordinary from a Maltese perspective. It's extraordinary from an international perspective. Obviously, we're going to have to wait for the outcome to see what the jurors ultimately conclude based on the evidence that's presented to them. Daphne Caruana Galizia's family was absolutely instrumental in the road to justice. They have led an extraordinary effort to keep the murder on the agenda and keep the focus on the pursuit of justice in this case. In a very, very difficult context. That links back to what I was saying earlier, because Daphne was a very controversial figure and very much read within sort of the polarized political context in Malta. Nothing was straightforward about her death or about the pursuit of justice.
We had to make it our mission to ensure that something positive came out of my mother's assassination, that society's response, rather than one of fear, would be one of courage, and that society would grow stronger from what happened. We understood immediately that if we weren't successful in doing that, then society would grow weaker. When something like this happens, it's always a turning point for a country. So it could have either got worse or better, and for a time it got worse, and it was years before it started to get better, and it's still quite bad. And in fact, the public inquiry into my mother's assassination found that Malta was on the way to becoming what it called an entrenched mafia state, and that if it weren't for my mother's assassination, that would have been Malta's future. And so it wasn't the assassination that saved the country, it was society's response to the assassination that changed the country's destiny.